It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, just tell us, as British listeners who don't necessarily know much about Burma, Myanmar, why this country matters so much.
Well, Britain has had a long association with Burma, and we campaigned for democracy for many decades, and that culminated in Aung San Suu Kyi being released, and then the gradual transition towards democracy, although albeit imperfect, because the military continued to hold control over security policy, defence, and other policies. So, here in the UK, there are many who've campaigned for that transition, but also campaigned for democracy, human rights. And we saw the emergence of democracy, but we also saw the last few years with major human rights violations, including, of course, the genocide, which was committed by the military. Unfortunately, Aung San Suu Kyi defended the military, but the reality is that the military carried out those attacks. 700,000 people were forced out of Myanmar, Rakhine State, in 2017 and are living in refuge in Bangladesh. So the situation now with the military coup means that not only is it minorities that have been subject to the atrocities by the military, but the rest of the population now is effectively under siege in the hands of the military, and they've shown no respect for democracy. They've shown no respect for the fact that over 80% of the population voted for the National League of Democracy Party, NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party. And that is deeply problematic because it shows that authoritarianism is on the rise, and the international community needs to step up and take action against that.
We'll talk about the future of the democratic movement and the protests on the street in a minute. But this leaves Aung San Suu Kyi in a rather interesting position, doesn't it? Because, I mean, here she was one of, she was the Nelson Mandela of Asia. She was a, Nobel laureate. She was under house arrest for, over a decade. She was a kind of the symbol of democracy in parts of the world where democracy wasn't always forthcoming. And then she completely ruined her image and disappointed so many of her supporters, especially outside Myanmar, with her defense of the genocide against the Rohingya people. Now she's back under house arrest. Now she's back as the champion of democracy. Where does that leave her?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It was deeply disappointing that she didn't stand apart from the military. In fact, she aligned herself with the military and their attacks on minorities, particularly the Rohingya. And
not that it did her any good, right? I mean, they still got...
That's right. It didn't do her any good, and it damaged her reputation for the very reasons you point out. And the fact is that she should have taken a leadership role. But the point here, the discussion here is about what, as far as I'm concerned, what do we do from this point? And the international community has got questions to answer as well, including our government. We've campaigned over, hundreds of MPs and peers have called on the UK government to refer the Burmese government under Aung San Suu Kyi to the International Court of Criminal Court. And when the ICJ, International Court of Justice case came to the fore to protect against further atrocities against the Rohingya, our government, which is the penholder in the UN Security Council, has continually refused to take action on the justice side. Now, if governments, whether it's Aung San Suu Kyi in her leadership role with the military, or now the military, continue to be allowed to act with impunity, then of course you're going to get more repression, and that's what we're seeing.
So the Biden administration in Washington has announced sanctions against some of the military leaders who are involved in this coup, in the reversal of democracy. What should our government be doing that it's not already doing?
Well, our government has so far been very meek in its actions towards the Myanmar government. And what we need to see is our government joining the US and other partners in applying pressure with targeted sanctions against the Burmese military interests. Now, we're not calling for blanket sanctions because that would harm civilians. Mm-hmm. But what we do need is targeted attacks and sanctions against the business interests of the military. We need a thorough look at our trade and investment in Myanmar so that our businesses are not investing in military interests, because in essence, that just emboldens them. That has continued to embolden them. And the final thing I would say is that lessons need to be learned from what's happened. The Myanmar military has cynically held on to power, even during the transition towards democracy, as you will know. And the international community allowed the sanctions to be removed without conditionality and protection of human rights and protection of minorities when that transition happened. We need to make sure that the sanctions are tough, they hit them where it hurts, and that there's a resolution at the UN Security Council, and the military should be referred to the International Criminal Court, frankly, for the atrocities they've committed towards the Rohingya population. The UN fact-finding report found them guilty of stated that they had committed genocide. Now, the international community needs to hold the military to account by seeking justice. So we need to do both. We need the sanctioning, but we also, and furthermore, we need to act to ensure there's a global arms embargo so that they don't continue to use arms to repress people.
Right.
Even if the Chinese and the Russians don't follow suit, it's very important the rest of the international community take a leadership role here.
You brought up the Chinese there. Finally and briefly, the Chinese apparently are not very happy about the military taking over like this. They actually had rather good relations with Aung San Suu Kyi for many reasons. Some of them might be quite suspect, namely, her defense of the genocide against the Rohingyas and so on. What should we do? Should we be working with the Chinese to try and reverse the course of events there? And to what extent?
Of course, we should work with any of those governments that have influence in the region. But the fact is that too often our government and others have used the Chinese and the Russians as a reason not to act. And that is not acceptable. By constantly saying we can't do anything because the Chinese and the Russians will block it or whatever, then it doesn't resolve any issues. So yes, of course, we need to use all our relations with the Chinese, diplomatic relations and influence. But if they don't support the international effort, we need to work with our American allies to apply the pressure that's needed, because otherwise we're going to be left doing very little when the military has committed genocide and now a coup.